Good afternoon, everyone. I am Nick Lund. I am the Advocacy and Outreach Manager for Maine Audubon. Wildlife group, been around for a long time, working on behalf of wildlife in Maine. And I am also a co-founder of BirdSafe Maine. I'm going to go ahead and start sharing so we can see what that is. BirdSafe Maine is a collaboration between us, the Portland Society for Architecture, the University of Southern Maine, and Avian Haven, the rehabilitating group. And what we are doing is educating and working on policy issues surrounding bird building collisions in Maine. And I'm going to give some background a little bit. I'm going to be very quick and then talk about where we are with this draft ordinance. And then I will turn it over to Kevin for a few minutes to talk about the city's view on this. And then we'll open up for discussion. So let's just jump in. It's June right now. We are at the tail end of spring migration. This is the annual movement of billions of birds across the landscape from southern areas where they spent the winter up north to where they can get insects and have babies throughout the summer. Then in the fall, billions of these birds move back to escape the dropping temperatures and to find safety in parts south. The country that they are flying over looks very different than it did 150 years ago, right? Humans have moved across the landscape and made many changes that birds have to negotiate as they move both north and south and all year. This affects them on sort of a large scale and also a micro scale. As birds migrate across the Portland Peninsula, they are largely migrating at night. It's calmer at night. There are fewer predators around. When the sun comes up, they need to get out of the sky and they come down wherever they are. If they are on the Portland Peninsula, and many of them are, they have to basically work their way to safety. Every city across the country experiences this sort of fallout and movement during migration. In Portland, it generally works because migratory birds don't like to fly out over the ocean or over water where they're exposed. We have found that the movement is generally in towards land. In South Portland, they basically stop and head back around. On the peninsula, they basically work their way back inland and around. And as they do that, they encounter lots of buildings. So as they are moving towards safety to find food and movement during the day, they encounter lots of buildings. And as they encounter lots of buildings, they strike glass and injure themselves. These are some images that we collected this spring during our route walking. We have a common yellowthroat and a least flycatcher, a black and white warbler, a white-throated sparrow, ruby-throated hummingbird, black-throated blue warbler, black-throated green warbler. These birds all struck buildings and died on the streets of Portland just this spring. We have been working to walk routes during spring and fall migration in Portland for 3 years now to identify whether the emerging science about bird collisions matches to Portland. Do birds die on the streets of Portland, and are they dying more frequently against buildings we suspect to be more dangerous? The answer after 3 years of surveying is an unequivocal yes to both questions. This is a major problem around the country. So the science has estimated that every year between 365 million and nearly 1 billion birds die in the United States as a result of flying into buildings, making bird glass collisions one of the leading causes of bird mortality in the country. We have taken the information from some of the scientific papers and done an analysis of how many we think die in Portland every year, and I've determined that between 40 and 50,000 individual birds die just in the city of Portland every single year. Now, why is this a big deal? You may not think it is, but lots of people around the country are raising alarms about the decline in birds. Over 3 billion birds have been lost overall population in the United States, and that's a trend that is continuing downwards. And so we are seeing the rapid decline in bird populations really across the families, and are working to reverse that. The good thing about the bird glass collision projects is that we know what the problem is, and we can do something about it. The problem is glass is tricky. large areas of glass reflect the sky. And so birds thinking that they're flying through the sky hit glass, not noting it's there. Glass also reflects vegetation. And so birds that move through the habitat think they're seeking safety or finding food, but fly into glass. Glass is also transparent in certain conditions. And so when glass is lit up, for example, at night from within, it appears invisible. And so birds strike for both of those reasons. This is a problem that is sort of gaining widespread understanding just in the past decade or so, as scientists are really quantifying both the problems and the scope of the problem, and cities are taking action. So more than a dozen municipalities across the country have passed BirdSafe ordinances just in the past decade or so, including two major cities, New York City and Washington, D.C., just this past year. This is not something that is taught in architecture school. This is a new issue for many folks in the building and design community. And so these ordinances are coming about to help educate folks and to provide some protections for new buildings that come in for birds that are migrating through. And so it is our goal, working with this coalition, to pass a similar ordinance for Portland. We have done a lot of work to get to a point where we have a draft now. Started really when we were founded in 2020 and began to monitor the streets of Portland. But things picked up in this over a year ago in April when we did a presentation of our work to the City Council Sustainability and Transportation Committee, and they asked us to pursue an ordinance. We were joined by a University of Maine student last year who studied ordinances across the country, so we could learn from experience, learn what worked in an ordinance, what didn't work in an ordinance, and so we could use those lessons to apply to our own experience. Last summer, thanks to Addie and PSA, we convened a small group of architects and designers, and then a larger group to discuss the issue and discuss the sort of framework of an ordinance. And then from there, we worked with the City of Portland to see how such a draft would fold into their processes and could be enforced. And from there, we've got here. So we have a draft. I think we are proud of the work that we have done to make sure that this is both effective, but also sort of as seamless as possible, and as least onerous as possible. We've learned some lessons from other cities and made sure that this ordinance, avoids some of those some issues and sort of is effective and simple at the same time. I'll sort of read through this piece by piece so we're on the same page about sort of what is said in here. First, as a definition, when we talk about the bird safety measure of glass, especially, the leading testing agency organization for bird safety is a group called the American Bird Conservancy. They have tunnels and do all kinds of product testing as products come on the market to see which are effective and how effective. And they give products ratings from 1 to 100 of bird safety. So a material of 1 would basically be a wall, a brick wall or something, something that a bird is not reflective at all. And 100 would be a mirror, for example. The majority of ordinances that have passed, especially in New York, so most every single ordinance that passes includes a requirement that materials be used with a certain threat factor. And so the American Bird Conservancy keeps a list, and you can organize by number and see what products fit that number or not. One of the lessons we learned from New York City, they passed their ordinance with requiring a threat factor of 25. We are hearing that that's too low, and that moving up to 30 opens up a lot more products that are possible to use on buildings that make things a lot easier. So in New York City, they are finding the 25 limit to be a little too much, but moving that up just 5 opens up a whole new world of products that can be used. in certain in buildings. So we are hoping that this ordinance will apply to large buildings. Kevin can talk perhaps a little bit more about this, but looking at the scale of ordinances around the country, some apply to residential buildings, some apply to buildings of any size and shape. So part of crafting this was to figure out just what the applicability would be and to what size. And so this, we're hoping, will apply to new construction or additions greater than 10,000 square feet. And then also there is the second piece here of if a building is, completely renovated or redone, how can we get applicability in there too? This is a tricky one. We don't want to make it so, for example, and there are some ordinances that have sort of not considered this. If a window breaks in a building and a building owner comes in to replace the window or is doing a small renovation, some ordinances would require the whole building to be, renovated with BirdSafe materials. We want to avoid that and make this something a little more simpler to follow. It's tricky figuring out how to apply this, but what we've landed on is if at least 50% of the building's exterior glazing is replaced within 3 years, then we'd ask for bird safety. So we could talk about that. That's a tricky thing, I think, to enforce perhaps, but we are working on that. So what we're requiring is facades up to 75 feet. This is typical for most cities. In Portland, frankly, there aren't a ton of buildings higher than 75 feet, but in different cities where there are tall buildings, it's different. One of these sort of not necessarily obvious points about the science here is that most bird strikes occur at low levels rather than up high in the sky. As I showed in the earlier slide, birds land during migration, then move through the city to find safety. They're mostly going at the treetop level or below. And so a lot of the strikes occur at that, first or second floors. So up to 75 feet is the standard for most ordinances. The other piece down, the second sentence in that requirements piece is a bit complicated, but most ordinances, and ours does too, allow for some area of non-bird safe material. For any number of design elements or other architectural features. But what some ordinances have done across the country is sort of allow for, say, a percentage of material to not have bird safety. And what that could lead to is, grouping non-bird safe material in an area that's very dangerous. So if you have a whole lot of area that's not bird safe, say around an entrance, then that just becomes a very hazardous area. And so the typical language that we have borrowed from a couple other ordinances is this: you can use 10 feet within any 10 by 10 area below 75 feet. So we can talk about that as we go. The other two sort of applicability things are a bit redundant. They apply to areas that are above 75 feet. And so these will not really come into play too much in Portland. But there are certain areas that are more dangerous than others, called hazard installations. These are things like skywalks or glass railings or other sort of glass features that are dangerous. The other one down here is what we call fly-through conditions. I can move that up a little bit. Fly-through conditions, like if you have windows that are very close together, a bird can see through to, say, a tree on the other side. They may fly through. Those have been shown to be extra hazardous. And so these two, along with the green roofs, these two apply if you're building above 75 feet and have those conditions. So those are unlikely to occur that frequently, but we do want to have those in there. And then finally, we wanted to figure out how to allow for, so we have some exemptions, and a couple of them are to allow for the use of windows that are not considered dangerous. Typically, when we talk about dangerous windows, we're talking about basically large immovable panels. But there are lots of different kinds of windows that don't cause the same kind of problems, basically smaller windows. Operable sash windows is the term we came up with down here. Those would be exempt from this. Finally, historic landmarks are exempt. That's one that's basically across the board in all different ones. And then finally is the first floor window for retail storefronts as required by the city's design manual. And I think Kevin could perhaps talk a little bit more about that. I just want to say finally that last week, we are also working on this issue from the state level. Last week, the state of Maine passed this bill. So it passed the Senate, has not been signed by the governor yet. But it's called an Act to Protect Birds and the Construction, Renovation, and Maintenance of Public Buildings. This makes Maine just the third state to take statewide action on bird safe architecture. And what it does is just pulls groups together and working with the state to develop guidelines for how bird safe architecture may be employed in state-owned buildings or state-funded buildings. So this is an issue that is finding some resonance at the state level as well. That's my short intro. I hope that was short enough. And now I will stop sharing and turn it to Kevin.
Thank you, Nick and Addie. I'll be fairly quick so we can get into the discussion. But my name is Kevin Kraft. I'm the Deputy Director of Planning and Urban Development. Really excited to be here and to be joined by my colleague, Troy Moon in the Sustainability Department, and really been happy to work with PSA and Maine Audubon on this draft ordinance. From the city's perspective, when our department was brought into this effort, we were really excited to get involved. Obviously, Nick mentioned that there are a number of communities that have adopted various bird safe ordinances, but it's still fairly new. And I think that's something that we're always excited to be kind of at the forefront of some of these various policies, much like we did with ADUs. So we were happy to kind of get in there and work on this draft with everybody. Nick went through where we're at currently in terms of what the draft is looking like. I'd say from our perspective, from the cities, when we first got involved, I think our big goal was really to have a simple and clear regulation. So something that was really clear to an applicant and something that permit technicians could easily implement. There are a lot of great ordinances out there that are good, have great intentions and good natured, but they're really challenging to follow and to actually regulate. So our goal here was for simplification. The other element, and Nick touched on this in terms of the applicability and the size, as we went through our various discussions in the fall and winter and working with Nick, our perspective was to focus primarily more on the worst offenders. So the larger buildings that are primarily using glass as kind of the start of trying to implement this regulation. One of the reasons for that was wanting to make sure that we had an ordinance that was more set up for success, as opposed to putting out something that was extremely restrictive and we received a lot of pushback on, and applicants or architects trying to find ways to get around the ordinance as opposed to working with it. So we felt like at the scale of 10,000 square feet, which aligns with the city's major site plan thresholds, that we would be able to proactively work with applicants early on for these larger buildings and have more success that could potentially be expanded on in the future as these technologies kind of evolve in the future, and perhaps expand this more broadly. So that was some of the thought process behind the city's recommendations on the size thresholds. The other concern we really had was in terms of recommending a policy that could potentially be regressive. We didn't want to kind of put onerous requirements on somebody that may just be trying to replace a window, double hung window in their single family home, and have issues perhaps finding a product at, say, Home Depot or Lowe's, and maybe it's not carried at those locations at this time. So we were, again, trying to not have a policy that was more aggressive and have something that was set up more for success. And for these larger projects that generally have, engineering and architecture teams involved. In terms of the placement, this was something that we talked about a lot here at the city. So our department here at the Planning and Urban Development Department, we work primarily on site plan subdivision applications. As many of you are familiar with, you then, after you get your site plan approval, go to the Permitting and Inspections Department, and they review your building permits. We felt like, in looking at other codes as well, that this was actually an ordinance that probably will live best in Chapter 6 in the building code, and ultimately be something that is regulated during the time of building permit. I think if this ultimately is successful and goes to the city council early on so that folks become more familiar with this, I think our department would certainly try to remind folks through the design review process and at pre-application meetings of this requirement, so folks are incorporating these technologies early in the design process, as opposed to getting through a site plan approval and then being told, oh, and by the way, you now have to do BirdSafe glass. But in terms of our vision of where this lives, we think it'll live more appropriately in building or chapter 6 with the building permits. Addie, I'll stop there just so we can kind of get into more of discussion, but just wanted to kind of give a high level overview of where the city's perspective was on this, and happy to answer any questions.
No, that's perfect. Thank you. And thank you, Nick, very much too. That was a good, concise overview. So I know that, again, I mentioned earlier, Patrick Booth is our VP and usually runs with these, facilitating these conversations, but he is also a practicing architect in Portland. And so I know he had a lot of questions. So I'm putting you on the spot first,
Sure,
but then
no.
I really
Yeah,
would love folks to weigh in on this as well.
Yeah, happy to start off with some questions, get the ball rolling here. Thanks, Nick. Thanks, Kevin, for speaking about the ordinance. It's important that we start considering thinking about this. It has a lot of impact, and so getting something started on paper so that it's more there's more awareness around it, I think is the first step in the right direction. So I guess some of the questions that I had was that I guess with Kevin, with the point of clarity, you had mentioned it going into the chapter 6 for the building, the portion of the code of ordinances that was talked about building, but that it is also, of course, important that it's not that it is vetted pretty early on with the building. So, and like you said, it's going to be through site plan. And so, would you foresee that? Because I would think that BirdSafe is not just about the material, because it's a lot about its location. It's the environment in which it's in, the whether or not there's the orientation of the they're just like layers of materials, for example. So you can have a 100 piece of glass, but if you put like a wood scrim in front of it, then it has no threat factor. So that being said, is that I guess as a practicing architect, I'm a little nervous about having that kind of discussion being further down the line. I'm curious, like, is it just something that could be part of a checklist on the site plan review process that is allowed, that is all at least comprehensively discussed before going the building inspections? And I know you had mentioned that there's early discussions going on, but almost a level of 90% this should be fine before we go to inspections. It seems more comfortable to me than because it can be a very different architecture to address BirdSafe essentially, versus just, you can't sometimes just change a material, for example. So I guess if you wanted to answer about like what kind of steps might you foresee about helping people with the site plan process, and if there's something more formal with it with the planners and the planning board.
I think that's a great question, Patrick. I think we're certainly open to the idea of trying to make sure that folks are set up for success going into that permitting and inspections building permit process. I think right now we see this being more of a conversation through the site plan review. So when we get that project at 10,000 square feet and a project utilizing a large amount of glass, making sure that is a discussion. I don't think we'll have, for instance, we don't have site plan standards that would have any kind of standing for the planning board to make a finding on. But I think as part of our design review process, we would certainly make sure that whatever is approved at the planning board level or at staff level would be appropriate at the building permit stage. I think in terms of what you're mentioning, in terms of orientation or other potential materials. So I think we are looking at whether that's an FAQ, like a fact sheet, or if it's part of our design review memos. As you may be familiar with, projects will receive a design review memo with certain standards. We may actually just start to incorporate notes that BirdSafe is required for these areas. So that's kind of bringing it to your attention early on, and can be more of a discussion with our staff earlier in the process, as before you get to building permit. But I don't see this being anything where the planning board will have any kind of role in terms of it in terms of their standards for approving a project at this stage.
Okay, yeah, so I guess that's the part I'm a little nervous about because you know, there's a list of 40 things that you put a narrative together for a site plan application. It's usually geared towards civil, but there's more and more design stuff that's coming around. And if there was simply said like, how do you address building chapter 6 ordinance BirdSafe narrative, and he just provided narrative, and it's like something that I'm just curious about how that could be an option for people, because I just, you know, like I said, like it's going to take some time to get everyone aware of this, and if it's not something that is like, you know, on the forefront of everyone who's like doing new buildings, then I think it would just be useful. But that's just kind of an opinion that I might have. And then my follow-up to that is that you know, nuances like the threat factor numbers, you know, you're talking about a 30. You know, we don't have much experience around BirdSafe. I mean, I didn't really know much about it until, you know, Addie started talking about it 6 months, a year ago, and I've been doing this for quite a long time. How do I qualify a 30 threat factor level? Do I hire a consultant? I mean, I know you mentioned, and sorry, this is probably more for Nick and not for Kevin, but maybe both, is that how could we use resources like the American Bird Conservancy to qualify materials? We're looking to make sure we're on the right track, but if we put, but it's also subjective, right? Because it takes a professional opinion, because if you have a material that is like fully reflective, but he had a nice architectural design that prevented that to being something that would cause a collision, then that could also help. So I find that I think it'd be useful to know how that mechanism might work to help, because that's the controlling thing in this whole ordinance, is that has to be less than 30. Like, who will tell us, who will confirm that it's less than 30? Because I imagine most people in building inspections, you know, don't have the training skill sets to recognize that, especially, and a lot of architects don't either. So I think that would be something that we would want to know is clear as well. I guess if Nikki had anything to explain.
Yeah, that's a really great point. One thing I'll say is, in the wake of the New York City law that passed, they worked to develop a set of guidelines that would be used in the city. That is something that we're prepared and we would hope to do if this ordinance passes, to really lay out in detail various product strategies, everything to sort of answer the question you talked to. So we're fully prepared to do that if that's a type of document that would help up front, and that could be that could be a document that ideally builders could rely on to help ensure their compliance. One other thing too, I'll just say, I mean, a lot of this is educational, and one thing we found repeatedly is that it is the earlier that you can consider the impacts to birds in the process of designing a building, the easier it is to comply. We have done this work, and more people are becoming aware of this. We are contacted by buildings all the time that said, you know, 20 years ago, I built a giant glass building, and now my employees, are having birds hit them, or the visitors to my building. It's much more difficult to address an existing building that is causing problems than it is to start with this in the back of your mind. And so that's really sort of part of the idea here. And the more we can do to address that early on, the more helpful we can be, the better the projects will end up.
I'd like to open up if anyone has any questions. I don't want to take the question end of things. And so if there's anyone who wants to raise their hand or just start speaking up, I think would be fine. I don't know if there's a raise hand button on this somewhere, but.
There is. And I'd like to prevent not calling on people too.
Right.
Opinions on their input, which I'm known to do. So keep that in mind. Then I might actually. I mean, I think
Addie, do you want me to? I could expand a little bit too, because I don't believe I touched on this in my little intro, but Nick touched on in some of the exemptions. We talked about, I just want to pull up the language here, exempting first floor windows for retail storefronts or for food and beverage uses, including bars, restaurants, where ground floor transparency requirements are in place by our design manual. And the thinking behind that was we have a lot of places, if you're familiar with our design manual, where we require 0.7 visible transmittance. And that is really to make sure that we have active ground floors that people can engage with at the street level. And as we were going through this exercise, and I think Nick did some research too in the available products, we didn't want to have an ordinance that then kind of countered that design standard. And we felt like some of the actual bird safe measures, such as perhaps you have awnings or store decals or window displays, those could be, Nick, correct me if I'm wrong, options that can help prevent some bird collisions. So we felt like if there was an instance where we had a design standard in place to encourage transparency for storefronts, we really wanted to still honor that. At the same time, you'll notice it does call out retail storefronts and food and beverage. So if you had, for instance, a new building that was going to have an office space at the ground floor, you would still be required to meet the bird safe regulations. This is really intended to exempt something like Treehouse Toys or a restaurant and food and beverage to kind of get at what the intention of our design standards are.
And Kevin, can you note the HP requirements as well, or lack thereof?
Yes, and that was something, as Nick touched on, that's something that's been consistent throughout all of the ordinances. We looked at exempting landmark buildings or contributing buildings within historic districts. But then we did expand on that with, if there are additions to those buildings, they would certainly be required to meet this ordinance. And that was to ensure that the landmarks in those contributing structures were not altered to a place where they were then not meeting their kind of historic intent and kind of the reason that they were designated in the first place. So we felt that that was a good balance in terms of trying to push this ordinance forward, but at the same time still recognizing that we have some historic building stock that we want to maintain as well.
The other exemption is talking about operable windows, and so I read that and it seems very broad. I mean like most higher rise residential buildings in Portland, for example, will all windows, or at least most of them, will be operable. So would that mean that on an 18-story building or something that's going up that has operable windows, does that mean that none of those windows would need to follow BirdSafe guidelines?
I think that's one exemption we still want to further refine before this goes forward to the council. I think whether we have to put a square footage threshold on that, I think the intention there was to make sure that we were exempting things like we kept talking about City Hall in terms of the windows at City Hall are not really the problem, or perhaps even the building at 201 Federal Street, that those buildings, they aren't generally large panes of glass. 201 Federal maybe, I'm just using it as an example, but I think we are less concerned about kind of your traditional sized window and more concerned about something, for instance, is it the Memic building or these more large transparent buildings. So larger sheets of glass is what we were trying to capture with this ordinance, and not so much your individual operable windows. But we would certainly we'd be happy to take input, Patrick, in terms of terminology. That was something that we discussed a lot. Operable sash windows is what we've landed on now. I think there was a term, Nick, what was the term we were struggling with?
Case windows or unit windows?
Unit windows, and I think there are a number of folks that we weren't familiar with that terminology. Yeah. So I think we're open to ideas on what that's trying to capture, but generally what we're trying to get at is we're not concerned about your kind of traditional sized window. In larger buildings, we're concerned about the sheets of
really probably more related to your daylight opening, like how much glass you have that's not interrupted by a frame or a button, for example. And it's and I think that's probably it seems like that's, I mean, whether or not it's operable is different than whether or not there's like how much glass you have before there's like something that would obviously identify it as not a clear thing to fly through. But then that would get into the whole question about, costs and execution, because if we were to say that, a building like on 201 Federal, for example, had to implement BirdSafe glass for all those, it would be a rightful discussion about the fact that, I mean, if they weren't to change anything but change the glass spec, I brought like UV or something that might be helpful with that. is it was expensive. And so how has that helped with all the other, I mean, I think the ordinance, of course, is all about awareness and getting things started. I mean, like a new office building has non-operable windows on the waterfront, for example, there should be some mechanisms there. But then like we're still mitigating bird collisions overall with this ordinance, which is a great goal for that. But then there's going to be a lot of pressures from the industries about how we can successfully reduce the cost, because there's already, with like the Green New Deal and other things that bring cost of construction, making cost of construction more challenging here, especially like housing that is at anything that is reasonable in terms of market rate. You can't even build a house right now that could meet 100% AMI is what I understand with new construction. So if we were to then further affect that by having additional costs for BirdSafe, I think those guidelines would be very helpful to understand too, because what is the cost of a UV piece of glass, or does UV even work? I understand it might not even work well. And so, and if it doesn't work well, then like, well, what the heck should we do to help address this? So those are the kind of spinoffs that I think could happen with this. And I guess that's kind of the onus of the guidelines, or like knowing how. But if the exemption held true that operable windows just aren't affected, and then you just deal with the ones of the worst offenders, which is the ones that are large fixed windows that are like a curtain wall for an office building, for example, then that would still have success to have that be addressed. So I think it's just knowing how to calibrate it, where you like how much you want to affect change and how much is going to go against the grain of like construction costs.
And that was, I'll let Nick speak, but I just say I think that was one of the things that we were approaching this ordinance from, was we've seen so many regulations come into play and impact the cost of construction, and that was one of our real big concerns, of like continuously adding on to those layers of costs, and then that's impacting our affordability. So we were trying to strike that right balance, and I think that's kind of the direction that we were trying to head with some of these exemptions in terms of the operable windows. But I think looking at a threshold is still something we need to finalize, but I think that was the intent we were trying to get at, was not trying to make it overly burdensome for primarily what you're seeing as residential development that are kind of using these operable windows, and focus more on the other types. Nick, did you want to add
Well,
something?
I mean, I think the goal of that window exemption and some of the other, the guidelines we may develop is to not make this so exotic. We don't need to use new products, to make something bird safe. There are plenty of buildings in Portland that are bird safe without even having to think about it. When I talk to homeowners, and I tell them, the safest thing you can do for your window is put an insect screen on it, that they probably do already. And so there are lots of ways to have windows, and lots of buildings that are built with windows that are not causing problems. And so sort of raising awareness of that among architects and figuring out how those can fold in. So either you can focus more on the, like you say, the large, more dangerous panels, or consider ways to not make this cost anymore. The studies that we have heard is that if designed from the start with bird safety in mind, these don't cost anymore. And there are plenty of ways to comply with this without having to consider fancy products or even anything that's hasn't been available for decades.
I'll reach back out. Does anyone who's joining us today have any questions to add to the group today?
Well, I do want to point out both Tim and Nicole were around the roundtable discussion we had in October discussing this, and they both work on fairly large scale projects. So it would be awesome, I am putting you on the spot, to hear and run through a few things as well. And I also want to reiterate that the role that both Audubon and PSA will take is just providing as many resources as possible, just as reference to work in tandem with the city and how we vet that and what gets posted. Katie Netland is our GP-COG AmeriCorps Fellow, wearing right in the pink shirt. And Katie has put together an extraordinary soft launch of a website that lists bird safe projects in Maine to date. I have sent you, everyone, the link, we'll workshop that a little bit more, but all projects that happen in Maine, including residential, will be included in that. Just so people can see the pros and cons, because it isn't easy. It is quote unquote new technology, even though some aspects are not new by any stretch. And as Nick alluded to earlier, and also to reiterate, Kevin, it's not meant to be so onerous that it kills the project. So it is an evolution together. And so, yeah, I would love to hear from both Tim and Nicole on this. Take your pick.
Nicole, do you want to go first? No.
No, go ahead. Go ahead. If you have something.
Well, first of all, everyone, Nick and Addie and everyone, it's really terrific to see this evolve. And Kevin, it's great to see the city, involved and engaged in the conversation about this issue. And I was very fortunate to be part of the roundtable. I think it was in October, Addie. Is that when it came up last? Anyway, so I'm Tim Mansfield with Cambridge 7, and we're an architecture firm that's very involved in bird safety and the work that we do. As I mentioned in the roundtable, some of you heard that we've been doing a lot of work up at Bowdoin College, and most recently we just finished the Rue Environmental Center there, which does have a large glass lantern. And we were very cognizant of bird safety and worked on the mullion patterns, worked on the glazing spec, worked on the internal lighting controls, all the things that, Nick mentioned. If you do it early in design, it doesn't necessarily burden the project with cost. It's just smart thinking about being aware of what are the impacts of your design on the bird environment. Just to give you a little data, we have kept in touch with Bowdoin about that building, particularly because of the lantern. And to date, we don't have any bird deaths, which is really something we're very happy about. It's not something you can actually predict because it's not necessarily there is science to it, but there's also a bit of art, right, with bird travel and how they work. So anyway, I just want to applaud the design draft here. I think it's a great start. And I think, Patrick, your comment about, or question about, making sure that architects and designers are, during site plan review, when you go to the planning board, how does it get involved or discussed as part of the planning process? And I think Kevin's right. It's something that, is probably to be discussed. It's not governed during that process. It's governed through the building department, but I think it's really important to have the education aspect. I think what PSA is doing to get the word out is great. We as designers are doing it internally. And as you know, we're also involved with the Rue Institute up on at the Bean site. And we are in the process of design right now. And as Kevin knows, I think, because we've been through some site zoning process with the planning board, yeah, we are very cognizant of, how we're designing the facade. It is a larger building, so it has glass and, all the stuff that is concerning. But anyway, my takeaway on all of this is that the conversation that this is engendering amongst our design industry is the way to get the word out and to solve it. And to reinforce what Nick said, we have not found necessarily design results or design approach necessarily burdening our client with the budget. I think the glass specs are coming along quite substantially technologically. They are right now a little more expensive in terms of some of the technologies, whether it be frit pattern or glazing technology and lining and so forth. But that is starting to mitigate as more people are using it. It's becoming more of a demand in the industry. So I think we're going to start to see a modulation of any of those kinds of increase in costs. So I can keep talking about it because I'm a big fan of bird safety. So I want to support all of what we're doing here. And if we can be a resource to anyone at from Cambridge 7, we're happy to, talk with anyone about what we've been seeing and materials that we've been using. But a lot of the work that's been done down in New York City, certainly that document is pretty robust and a great resource. So I don't know, Nicole, you want to add to that?
Yeah, I was just going to say, I think the threat factor of 30 seems reasonable. I don't think that's super extreme. Just for a point of reference, the LL Bean project that we did, which some of you visited, when we calculated the facade of that without the feather friendly dots was 39. So even though it's largely a glass facade building, it was 39 before we put the dots on. I should recalculate it now that we have the dots on and see where we are now. But so I think that's reasonable and shouldn't be too hard for people to achieve. One thing I wanted to inquire about, and I think I brought this up in October, was the there's nothing, it seems the ordinance is mostly directed towards materials or assemblies. And is there any consideration for kind of overall facade threat factor versus individual materials? So when being as a reference, glass facade, but we covered it with wood slats. Those, if you were just taking straight numbers, the glass would be a very high number, and the wood slats are kind of hard to give a number to. So we use the USGBC's spreadsheet that they have for calculating a facade threat factor as our way to come up with what our overall facade of each side of the building is. And it's a factored number that they have the spreadsheet, and you plug in, your square footages of specific materials. But that is also, is that something that would be considered? Maybe not, because it could mean you may have an area that is larger than 10 by 10 that would have a higher threat factor than you may allow, but the overall facade would be less than 30. So just, I don't know if you've talked about that or if that would or could be a consideration.
It's a really great question.
I also want to point out that there's the Canadian version of the American Bird Conservancy has a form, but I think this is something for both Nick and Kevin and myself and even Katie to talk about in, matching that USBG spreadsheet and actually doing your calculations for you would be a real critical piece to this. So Nick, I'm sorry to cut you off. I just wanted to say that I'm really smitten with that FLAP website, because it does go through and runs through all of your threats. And it was designed by conservationists and architects to kind of play out. So you yourself could assess, it's a self-assessment tool, but I think some kind of component or complement to this would be really smart.
Yeah, the goal is, the danger is whatever the outer surface is, right? And so if it's a window that is a mirror that is covered by a screen or is otherwise sort of mitigated in some way, it's that screen is what controls it. It overrides the sort of the danger of the glass. And so my hope would be that if you, under compliance with this ordinance, if, for example, you, Nicole, consider the wooden slats, that being the outer surface, that's a factor of 1 or whatever low surface it would be. And so what's underneath it, it does get tricky. What if there's a section over top of that screen or the wood where it is reflective? How exactly that's calculated is tricky. So I see where you're coming from.
Yeah, because there's a square footage of glass that is more than 10 by 10 square feet that is not treated, that would have a high number, but overall the facade could be lower.
Right.
So that's maybe you don't want to go there, but just wanted to put it out there in case that was a consideration or talked about.
I don't know what's simpler. I think one thing we have tried to go to is what is the simplest way to do it. For example, there is a completely other way to quantify this, which is sort of a landscape threat, which some cities have tried. So if you say, how close are we to water, for example, how close are we to trees, for example, the lesson that we had learned in all our study of the ordinances is that is much more complicated to predict and enforce, because trees change and and honestly, the science is sort of unclear on what that is. In Portland, in our experience, we have found some buildings that cause strikes very clearly because they are close to trees. Others are not anywhere near anything. And it's really the amount of glass on the facade is the predictor. And so we found in our experience with our ordinances is that focusing on that, not that it's perfect, but is simpler for everyone at the end of the day.
Great. Any more questions? We actually had a lot more architects sign up that did not show up today. So
So there's
again,
a question in the chat, Addie. Austin threw in a question.
brilliant. Yes, fascinating. To Nicole's point, is there a method to consider alternate solutions, and is there an appeals process?
Great question. It's my intention to make this as flexible to comply with and creative to comply with as possible. And so I don't know whether that's a sort of, I don't know how that, if you consider that, alternate solutions or an appeals process, but one of the, but there are lots of ways to comply, really, is what I'm trying to say. And so figuring out how we get there, whatever mechanism that is, I think is beneficial for everyone.
Yeah, and from the regulating perspective, I think, again, we want to make it as simple as possible to achieve the goals that we're looking to with this ordinance. I don't think we're looking to draft kind of a formal appeals process, whether that would go to something like the BSA or if a permitting decision went back to the planning board or anything like that. But I think we're definitely open to considering kind of how our ordinance is flexible enough to accommodate those alternative suggestions that Nicole mentioned. Because I think the description that Nicole brought up, I think is getting at what we're trying to achieve with this.
Yeah, perhaps it's similar to what you would do in building code, that there's prescriptive way to do it, and that is you have everything be TF 30 or less your material, for materials, but that you can say there's or demonstrate an alternate compliance of an overall. I mean, some sort of professionally vet, because like there's still going to be, once we get to that level of an alternate compliance, it's outside of the resource responsibility of our staff and team in Portland to feel like they need to be the ones responsible for that. So if there was an alternate compliance that had either architects who with experience with that, or they had consultants or something that helped demonstrate that this building has been designed with measurable like decreases in its risk of bird collisions is I think another element that could add another level of flexibility, less stress on that first line about threat level, that would still meet the overall goal of reducing overall bird collisions. Because if anything, it's like someone will have to go through the effort of making sure that yes, we are demonstrating that this is going less, even though we do have a selection of glass that is more cost effective at TF 38, but we have done this on the facade to reduce it, for example. So there might be, I don't know, maybe that's the sort of thing that could be an line added to it that could be helpful for compliance.
I think that's something we can certainly consider. I would say coming out of the Green New Deal, there's some language like that, and it's been extremely challenging for folks to regulate, and it's resulted in significant delays, I think, on both ends. From what we've seen in terms of trying to use third parties or other alternative methods to demonstrate compliance with that. So I think you raise a good point, Patrick, that maybe there is some language. I think in terms of how it's played out for the Green New Deal, it's created a situation where we're seeing frequent requests and they vary significantly. So it's almost creating a new regulation each time and has to be re-vetted. So I think if there was a way to do that in a crisper manner, it might be a good form, but I get the idea in terms of finding a solution.
At least you have more control over writing what the language of the ordinance is than the Green New Deal. So I would like so but yeah, that's I think that's just because it's just the earlier point that it's a lot of things collectively that make a building more bird safe and not specifically just one material. So like I think that's the part that's might be missing in this that Nicola brought up.
Nicole threw in the calculator, and also
Oh,
Kate
great.
threw in a paper that I'll also share with folks about cost efficiency. That would be a nice read for folks as well. So thank you.
Great.
Again, any more comments? We are at the top of the hour. I just want to make sure things are heard now. Questions, concerns? Going once.
I think this has been great. I thank you for everyone's time for
I mean,
sharing all
thank
this
you.
information. It's
Thanks,
really
Addie.
Thank you for the patience too with this. It's not easy to bring this up in the design community. It's, you know, and I fully respect and understand the challenges with new technologies or new products. I know it has not been an easy ride, and but I also know that suppliers are stepping up as well and coming up with alternatives. The UV has been in debate for a while, and yes, I will say it, you know, whether it's official or unofficial, but don't use a UV here. Very rarely does it work in Maine. It is very successful at the UNE campus, and I would love more information on that. They monitor it, their students study that site, but for other projects, it has not worked, and it is very expensive. Really, the most successful have been the fritted, and people really have a reaction to that. But there are also really beautiful applications. You could play with it. You know, you're all designers, you're creative thinkers. I often use the Columbia Business School example as a really clever way of working in a commercial application with the frits and design. That said, it's also, you know, as designers, the brise soleils, screening, and any other kind of creative application that could be encouraged. And I also think I'm hopeful too, and this opens a can of worms and everyone will be like, "Wah!" But the temporary measures as well, you know, for existing buildings, what can you do during particularly migratory season or seasons of very fragile environments or nesting, mating, what can be done, you know, from the wax painting at elementary schools to netting to shields to a whole host of things. So there's still a world out there of design play that's efficient. And I would encourage you to keep pushing on that as well. So I will send this recording out to everyone with some of the links. Again, Katie has been working diligently on the website of existing projects. It's a really great reference that we'll just keep, you know, we'll keep adding to it. And otherwise, I believe, Troy, are we on the agenda for sustainability? I believe sooner than later.
You can be. I want to follow up with Kevin and see where he stands, but I know Councilor Zara, who is the chair of the committee, is very anxious to get it back in front of the committee.
Great. Well, good. And any other questions, you know where our emails are. So there's one more message before I sign off. Okay, great. Thank you. Brilliant. Any last words, Kevin or Nick, Troy?
Just want to thank you all for taking the time and getting us to this spot.
Yeah, thank
Thanks,
you.
everybody.
Thank you, everybody. That was great.
Great.
Really great.
Go.
All right.
Great.
Thank you.
Okay. Bye.